Hello everyone, and welcome to Women and Children First, our virtual space. My name is Sarah Hollenbeck, and I'm the co-owner of Women and Children First, one of the last feminist bookstores in the United States. We're honored to host this virtual celebration tonight for the release of The Cherry Robbers by Sarai Walker. Sarai is joined tonight by our beloved friend of the store and incredible author, Gina Frangello. We begin our virtual events as we begin our events held in the store with a land acknowledgement. So join me in acknowledging that the land on which our bookstore stands is the unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and Miami people. We encourage y'all to learn more about land acknowledgements and why we do them, and finding out the rightful owners of the land where we are watching tonight. We also want you to let us know you're here by using the chat, and also asking questions in the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. Gina will read those questions to Sarai later in the night. We also just want to take a breath and recognize that this is a really hard day for a lot of people. The news just keeps on coming and keeps on being increasingly horrific and enraging. So we want to thank you for being here tonight and choosing to take a moment to celebrate art and celebrate literature and celebrate this incredible book. Women and Children First is open for in-store browsing, and we do continue to ship and offer curbside pickup. So we have all your book needs covered. And you can buy Sarai's book by clicking the Buy the Book button located at the bottom of your screen. Okay, Sarai Walker is the author of the novel Dietland, so good, which has been published in more than a dozen countries and adapted as a television series. She has lectured on feminism and body image internationally and has spoken about these topics in the media. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Guardian, and elsewhere. She has worked as a writer and editor in the updated version of Our Bodies, Ourselves, and she lives in Philadelphia. Gina Frangello is the author of 4 books of fiction in addition to her memoir, Blow Your House Down. Her novel, A Life in Men, is currently under development by Shirley Sands production company, and her most recent novel, Every Kind of Wanting, was included in several best-of lists, including the Chicago Review of Books. She has nearly 20 years of experience as an editor, and having founded both the independent press of Our Voices and the fiction section of the popular online literary community, The Nervous Breakdown. She's also been published widely in LA Times Flashes, Psychology Today, and many other magazines. She lives mainly in Chicago and the California deserts. I just want to take a moment to say that The Cherry Robbers is pretty much the perfect way to kick off your summer reading. This is a gripping feminist ghost story that is ceaselessly engaging. Sarai is an author who is able to translate the complex inner lives and desires of women to the page in a way that is so satisfying, so readable, so suspenseful, and this is a real page turner. So please join me in welcoming Sarai Walker and Gina Frangello.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for hosting us. I'm just so happy to be here. And thank you.
Thank you. And Sarah, and of course, Women and Children First, greatest bookstore on earth. So I am really excited to talk to you about this book, which I devoured and just found as compulsively readable as Sarah described. But I would love it if you have, if you would like to maybe read a bit first, so that anyone out there who has not already gotten the book can get a sense of it and maybe better understand our questions.
Yeah, do you want me to do a brief plot summary first?
Feel free.
I'm not sure if people know. I'm sure some people know, but So the novel, I describe it as a Gothic, a feminist Gothic. So it's bookended by two present-day chapters. So at the beginning of the novel, we meet Sylvia Wren, who is 80 years old, and she lives in northern New Mexico, and she's very reclusive. And you find out that she's a very famous painter, like Georgia O'Keeffe level of fame. And so at the beginning of the novel, I'm going to read a little piece of this. She gets a letter from a journalist that sort of turns her life upside down, and who's basically kind of threatening to reveal her real identity. And so the bulk of the novel takes place in 1950s Connecticut, and Sylvia reflects on her past as Iris Chappell, one of 6 daughters of this very wealthy family that's part of a firearms dynasty. And so all of the sisters, I'm not giving anything away by saying that all of the sisters but one will die in very mysterious circumstances. So that's the point of her looking back. She's describing these mysterious deaths of her sisters back in the 1950s. And that's what the book mostly is about. And so we'll talk about all different things. There's a lot going on. We'll talk about some of these areas that I cover in the novel. But just to give you kind of a brief overview, that's what it's about. So it is Gothic, it's creepy, but it's also fun, I think. So anyway, so I think I'll read just a little bit from the present day chapter at the beginning, just to kind of give you a taste of how things kick off for Sylvia, the elderly artist in New Mexico. So when we start off, she has just returned from the post office and she has a big pile of letters. My study is at the back of the house, my desk positioned in front of the window that overlooks the flower garden and the hills, with a Cerro Pedernal in the distance, a mesa that looks like a neck with no head. The rocky hills behind the house are red, almost Martian in appearance. They deserve to be called otherworldly when so few things described that way actually do. I sorted through the letters, fighting the urge to dump them somewhere. I have to make an effort at practicality while Lola is gone. She's the one who normally handles that part of our life, paying the bills, doing the shopping, calling the plumber. I removed the electric bill from the stack of letters, then separated what was clearly fan mail, the airmail envelopes from Japan and South Africa, and the more familiar American envelopes, almost all of them with feminine handwriting. It's mostly girls and women who write to me. I'm not an artist, after all, but a woman artist. There were 2 more letters that I would pass along to my assistant, both on professional-looking stationery, the addresses typewritten, one from the University of Nebraska, the other from a woman in Greenwich, Connecticut, both almost certainly requests for something I will refuse to do. But I at least peek at some of the letters, so I'm not completely out of touch. The letter from Connecticut was the obvious choice. I tore it open and pulled out the sheets of slightly pebbly blue stationery. On the first page, printed at the top, it said, Eliza L. Mortimer, journalist and documentary filmmaker. Dear Miss Wren, the letter began, I'm a great admirer of your work. I groaned. Eliza, surely you could come up with something better than that. I've been desperate to get in touch with you. I'm a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker covering the art world. I called your agent hoping to connect with you, but he said you won't talk to journalists under any circumstances and refused to even forward my letter. Finally, after working many of my contacts, a friend of a friend was able to get your mailing address from a gallery owner. I'm sure you'll understand that I don't want to say who it was. I hope this letter has actually made its way to you. I understand that you don't want to be bothered, but ... On and on she went about how she loves my work and how she has a framed poster of the purple iris hanging in her bedroom. I didn't like the thought of my paintings as posters, as postcards, and likely as coasters and magnets and keychains. Why did I ever agree to that? Accessibility, my lawyer had said when I signed the licensing agreement. Art should be accessible to the masses. She'd implied I'm a snob, which is not the case. With my success, I could be living in a villa on the south of France, surrounded by acolytes and attending fancy parties. But instead, I live in a modest adobe house and drive a 14-year-old car, finding pleasure not in the world, but in my work, engaging each day in the ritual communion that produces it. I don't think it's too much to ask that this work not be turned into tacky trinkets destined to clog up a landfill. I was about to abandon Eliza's letter, since it was obvious her flattery was leading up to an interview request, but my eye caught the start of the next paragraph. At a recent luncheon at the Sandler Museum, I was seated next to a woman who grew up in Bellflower Village, Connecticut. I hailed quickly, a stabby breath of panic. Her name is Pauline Levasseur, and she's an art collector who splits her time between New York and Paris. She keeps a rather low profile and isn't flashy the way so many collectors are. Her maiden name is Pauline Popplewell. When I told her I'm based in Greenwich, she told me she grew up nearby in Bellflower Village. She recalled her childhood there fondly, saying she lived on St. Ronan Street in a big Victorian painted robin's egg blue that, according to her, was the prettiest house in town. I'm wondering if any of this sounds familiar to you. I laughed audibly, more like a scoff of confusion, alarm. Why would it be familiar to me? I'm Sylvia Wren, an artist who lives in Abiquiu, New Mexico. I was born and raised in Illinois, and now I'm a New Mexican. I know nothing of New England, or at least that's what I tell people. But I keep reading the letter because Bellflower Village, the Popplewells, and the house in Robin's Egg Blue are not actually unknown to me, or rather to the person I used to be. I don't mean to be coy, Miss Wren, so let me get to the point. Mrs. Levasseur had a bit too much champagne at lunch and let slip that she knows a secret about you. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. If I pretended I hadn't opened it, maybe I could keep whatever it portended from happening. It's not possible to rewind time, but I was willing to try. I stuffed the envelope into the stack of letters, closed my eyes, and imagined I had just returned home from the post office, sat down at my desk, and hadn't opened a thing.
I froze. Wait 1 second. I'm frozen. Am I frozen?
You're not,
screen?
you're
Oh,
not
okay.
frozen, but you kind of cut out for just a sec.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm frozen in my own screen, so I guess I don't have to look at myself.
But you're not frozen.
But I shall carry on. Thank you. So the one of the things that I said about this book instantly, and I think I said it on social media, is that while the book is a gothic horror story, in many ways, the books that it reminded me most don't really fall into that genre. And one of the things that it reminded me of most is The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood, in that it's an older woman who has grown rather cantankerous and disillusioned with the world through circumstance, and who has been in a kind of hiding, looking back on her past. And what I think struck me most about your book is that it defies kind of the formula that we often want to end books on in the publishing industry, in terms of, like, ending on this like kind of positive, she breaks away note. And so I wondered actually what inspired you to begin with the so much older Sylvia Wren looking back on her distant past, rather than ending with the younger Iris Chappell escaping to begin this grand new life. And that was it was a choice I loved, but it was a choice I would love to hear more about why you made.
Sure. So, it took me a while to sort of figure out how to write this novel. It really almost defeated me, I would say, for a long time, because it's so different from Dietland. And I really, I describe it as like a second first novel. I really had to just figure out what I was doing all over again, as if I'd never written a novel before. And so for most of the time I was trying to write it, I didn't have Sylvia, the older version of Iris, in the novel. It was all in the past. And I just, I got about 50 or 60 pages written, and I just couldn't get beyond that. Sometimes you just kind of hit a wall, and I'm like, this isn't working. I don't know why, because I love what I have, but it won't go forward. And one day I had this idea. I'm like, I think part of the problem was that I didn't like writing in the voice of somebody that was in the 50s, that was just in that time. And I thought, what if it's someone from more today looking back at that time? So I think maybe I kind of cheated, honestly, in writing a historical novel where I wrote a historical novel from the perspective of someone today. And I was like, well, what if she's, the older version of the character, and she's looking back and telling the story with all of the knowledge that she has now and the modern sensibility that she has now. And so I said, well, I'll try it, and I wrote like a first draft of what's now the first chapter, like with just in a couple days. It was just like came like her voice. She would just talk to me, and I just was like transcribing what she was saying. And so as soon as I clicked on that idea, then that was it. I broke the code of this novel, and that was it. So, I think part of what it adds, besides the kind of modern perspective and the idea of someone looking back who already knows the whole story, is that this story for Iris and Sylvia, the same person, is really about survival. And in the 1950s part, she only goes up to age 20. Well, anything could have happened after that. 20 years old is a kid, basically. And so I like the fact that even though we skip, the next 60 years, we see her older, and we can see that she is a survivor, that she didn't, survive in terms of the 50s story. And then, a few years later met her end somehow, or that she is a true survivor.
Right.
And so I think it gave me that as well. So that gave me like a lot of things that were really important. And I wish I had thought of doing that much earlier in the process. It would have saved me a lot of angst. But.
So I'm trying to avoid spoilers, although, as you say, all but one of the sisters do end up dead, and that is revealed fairly early in the book, so it's not really quite a spoiler. But one thing that also struck me is that the Chapel sisters are quite artistic, and not all of them, but a few of them are quite artistic, and that, without giving too much away, there seems to be a dichotomy between the peril represented by heteronormative relationships, marriage, sexual relationships with men, versus the artistic life, and that's something that several of the sisters grapple with even in their brief lifetimes. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the identity of the woman artist, as Iris says, as Sylvia Wren says, and the ways in which art and the pursuit of art has perhaps historically offered women a way out of the symbolic death of simple patriarchal adherence, even if not literal death, as in the case of the Chapel sisters.
Well, that's a big question. But yeah, so I think, I think in the 1950s part, there are two sisters the two that are sort of pushing back against, as you said, the kind of heteronormative culture, who are very artistic. And then another sister as well, who, Calla, who is a poet. And they're the three that sort of push back against the marriage and culture that the oldest two sisters and the youngest one are really obsessed with. And so I think that I was looking at, art as a way to, use your creativity to sort of liberate yourself, that it's a way to deal with all sorts of things in your life. So one of the things we find out with Sylvia is that she would use her trauma from her past as an artist, that she used that to create her art, at least to launch herself as an artist. And so I think that that was one of the tools that she started using very young, is using art as a way to process the trauma and the things that had happened to her. And, she becomes very interested in these abstract expressionist paintings that, to a lot of people just look like a bunch of splashes of paint. But she came to understand how they were about the subconscious and about expressing things that you can't really express otherwise. And so I think that that's part of it, as well as seeing art as a way to express things maybe you're not allowed to otherwise express, giving you that kind of a freedom and outlet. And then, in Sylvia's case, I mean, she was able to become very self-sufficient, later on in life because of her art. But I think that even if she hadn't, she would still have that outlet, to deal with her past and to just have the freedom to express the things that she experienced. And in her case, with paint, but
Right.
the many different ways that can happen. I don't know if I've answered your question,
Oh,
but
yeah, definitely. I mean, particularly I'm interested in the fact that that the sisters kind of use art as a way of surviving trauma, obviously, particularly the lone survivor as she moves into the future, which is just an interesting thing because I think it's at the crux of a great deal of art of people of all genders and all cultures, but can sometimes get a bit of a bad rap as though writing or painting or singing or anything based on trauma or as a kind of catharsis is somehow lesser. And so I think that's a whole interesting side conversation about the way that women writers and artists in particular are sometimes stigmatized, even though I think that that's an essential core of what drives so many artists through history to create. I was also definitely interested in the fact that, so as mentioned, the singular goal of marriage, and in particular this household's father as kind of an absolute patriarch. He's not only the owner of a firearm dynasty, but the mother has been marginalized and discredited so completely that even her own daughters don't believe a word she says, and she's all but absent from their lives. And so sort of the transaction between the father and the suitors certainly is interesting. And what I loved is that while while not all of the suitors are equally likable or compelling, none of them are portrayed as monstrous in any, really at all. They all seem to be fairly reasonable men of their time. And in fact, some are quite charming and seem to genuinely love the Chapel sisters to whom they are engaged. And yet there's still a situation in which these relationships are fraught with danger. And so I guess I was very curious about why you chose that symbolism, what you were kind of remarking on, without necessarily going into how each sister meets her end. But why that? Why marriage? Why relationships with men as sort of the thing that is particularly
well, so the mother of the family, Belinda, I loosely based her on Sarah Winchester. So I know some people have probably heard of Sarah Winchester. She had married into the Winchester rifle family, and then this was in the 1800s. And then when her husband died, she inherited all of his money, and then she moved to what is now like San Jose, and she built this enormous mansion that's called the Winchester Mystery House, which is a big tourist attraction, and it's supposed to be haunted and everything. But the legend goes that she was haunted by the ghosts of the people killed by the Chapel rifles. And I took that little nugget and used it to create this completely fictional character. So the mother of the family is this haunted figure, not just from the victims of the rifles that she thinks are haunting the family, but her own mother died giving birth to her, and her mother's mother died giving birth to her, and it goes 3 generations back, all the women dying in childbirth. So like this series of motherless daughters. And then Belinda survives childbirth, the first woman of her family in like more than 100 years. So and she has these 6 daughters, and she was basically kind of forced into marriage for financial reasons. And she didn't want to get married. She didn't want to have children. That's just not the life that she wanted, but she kind of got forced into it. So I think within her, Belinda carries this trauma of what happened to her foremothers in an era when marriage was dangerous because, 1/3 of women died in childbirth, in like the 1800s, or what we call it, the Victorian era. So marriage could quite literally equal death. And, her foremothers all did die in childbirth. So she carries that trauma in her that she's passed on to her daughters. I'm kind of dealing with this intergenerational trauma and using the Gothic to do that because it's so much about what's repressed, especially like the feminist Gothic. And so, when we begin the novel, when we begin the 1950s part, the eldest sister, the eldest daughter is getting ready to get married. And then that's where things go wrong. Belinda has a premonition that something bad is going to happen to her daughter. She gets married and the daughter doesn't listen to her. And so anyway, this tragic event happens and then it keeps happening. And so I felt that I kind of chose that, on the one hand, I just thought of this idea, right? I wanted to write an idea about these sisters. I knew very early on that I wanted almost all of them to die in a very strange circumstance. And then I thought about, well, what could kill them? And the idea came to me. So I built a story around that. So I tried to figure out, we're not trying to give away exactly what happens. That's why we're kind of talking around it. But I was like, well, how can I build a story around that? Because I have the idea in the first place. So, this idea that the trauma of marriage from our foremothers kind of went through to the context of the novel, which is in the 1950s. So this era of, especially when white middle class women were being pressured to, be the happy housewife and move to suburbia and have lots of kids and white picket fence and all that. And then, of course, Betty Friedan later wrote The Feminine Mystique about how all these women were so miserable and felt trapped at home. And so, there's kind of the trauma of that as well that's in Belinda's mind of like, even though the daughters, as you state, were really into it, the older ones, like they really wanted to get married. But she was like, she saw it as this very damaging thing that she worried that her daughters would not survive. Of course, this is in the context of a Gothic horror story. So, you have to consider it in that sense. But, I was thinking as I was writing about different 1950s housewives that we see in books, for example, April Wheeler in Revolutionary Road, who literally risked her life to escape the suffocating Connecticut 1950s housewife life that she had. I thought of Michael Cunningham's, Laura Brown.
God, yeah, one of my favorite novels.
Yes, all these narratives about these white 50s housewives that we have. And so I wanted to take that, here we have this mother who's carrying this past trauma. Here we are in the 50s. And I wanted to look at that kind of narrative and basically kind of blow it up, so the daughters never become that housewife. That's what they want, but they don't achieve that. Again, in the context of a Gothic horror, but I wanted to just take all of that. So there's a big stew in here of all these different ideas I'm kind of playing with, if that makes sense. But you were saying that the men that they're marrying aren't really like these monster, and I feel like for me as the author, it would have been easy to do that. It would have been easy for them to be these brutes and these horrible, controlling people, but I wanted to make it hard for myself. I wanted them to want to get married, the older ones, and I wanted the men, for the most part, to seem like they were really in love and that sort of thing. I think that there are glimpses that come through of, first of all the daughters are much younger than them, like more than a decade. And there's some of that controlling behavior, which back then wouldn't have been seen, it would have just been
right. There's the one line where I think it's Roz's fiance says to Roz's father, like, "Oh, she doesn't listen, does she?" And he says, "Oh, not very often." And it's like, it's not, wildly ominous in the sense that would be an ordinary conversation in the 1950s, but that it does make it quite explicit that, of course, the sisters are expected to obey their husbands in all things. And we do see each of them sort of shaping their own views as they become involved with these men.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of these young, kind of very powerless women, and then these men who are like their father, like these captains of industry, that come from these very wealthy families. One of them in the steel industry, one that's in oil. These men that are kind of ruling the world type thing. And then you see the dichotomy between them and these very young women who have basically experienced nothing of life. So while the men are affable and, nice, there's a creepier kind of dynamic that's going on underneath the surface. You've disappeared, Gina. I don't know if you know that. I can hear you.
I have not been able to see myself the entire time. So
can you see yourself now?
No.
Oh, I can see you now.
So I'm just talking in a vacuum.
Okay.
But I've been frozen since literally your reading when I was like, oh no. But if you can all still hear me, if someone can't hear me, I guess just stick it in.
I can hear you now. Yeah. You were a little icon a minute ago, but now you're back.
So one thing that I love about this book, and that that I guess I'm speaking almost, to the audience as well, but I'm curious about your intentions in this, is that, yes, it is a feminist Gothic horror story, no question. And yet, in my view, you can read this text even if you don't take the horror literally. And I think that phrases like intergenerational trauma, the absolute control of husbands, Belinda having been forced into marriage, which essentially does entail, if you're forced into marriage in her era, this also entails years of marital rape and so forth, forced childbirth, all of which are, prescient and current topics as well. But that, to me, I was able to read the book with a kind of suspension of disbelief. I don't read a lot of ghost stories, so I'm not actually even that familiar with the genre, but I felt like it existed equally on two levels. So as sort of like, as literal ghost story, but also as sort of like allegorical or symbolic ghost story in which the intergenerational trauma indirectly in other ways causes things to go wrong. And I wondered, is that just sort of a happy accident? I also read Bradbury's The Small Assassin that way. I read Toni Morrison's Beloved that way. And I wondered, did you hold any intention as you wrote of like, well, I want this book to function on both of these levels? Or did you just write it as a Gothic horror, and simply the feminist threads sort of emerged on their own to kind of exist in a parallel space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very interesting that you were wondering about that, because I wrote the novel as if it was all really happening in the world of the novel. Even though there are characters within the novel who say like, this isn't happening, telling Irish, what you're telling me, none of that happened. You're mentally ill. We're putting you in an asylum kind of thing. But I wrote it as if it really happened. She's telling the truth. But I wanted people to be able to read it so that if they didn't read it that way, so that they thought Iris is unreliable, or Iris is telling the story as some kind of allegory, or whatever it is, that none of that actually happened in the way she described it, but that you can still read the book and find it, I hope, interesting reading it that way. So I wanted it to be able to be read both ways. But I also, I wanted, so anyway, it's happening within the world of the novel, but I wanted it to be for the reader. I was hoping it would be more allegorical, so I love, for example, Jose Saramago, who wrote Blindness, and he has this novel, I think it's The Stone Raft. His novels often have these very strange things in them that couldn't really happen in real life. So in one of the novels, the Iberian Peninsula like breaks off from Europe and floats off into the ocean. And in the novel, that really happened, but obviously he's making a point, of his political point by writing that story. And I was trying to do something similar, like, yes, in the world of the novel, it's happening, but I was assuming that people would just read it as an allegory for however they interpret it. So, so I feel like you got that really.
and Holly Stovall in the comments, she also has a question that we'll get to in a moment, but says the gendered quality of mental illness treatment is another strong theme you've balanced, which is, I think, quite true, because on the one hand, Belinda truly is a negligent mother. She's not someone you would want to sign up to have as your mother. She believes she's conversing with spirits, that, you know, I mean, she's a haunted woman. And on the surface doesn't take much interest in her children. Yet she's the only one who ultimately tries to save them. And she is, you know, institutionalized at one point in the novel against her will, which was absolutely normative in that era. So I also thought that was very well handled, because it was, nothing in this novel is just an easy binary. You know, it's not sort of like, oh, Belinda is secretly just the wonderful heroine and everyone misreads her. I mean, she's not, you know, she's not pulling her weight here, and she's making things really hard for her kids. But at the same point, she's an incredibly oppressed and abused woman. And so the novel really is in conversation with itself constantly, I think, about the ways in which we sort of become sometimes what society makes of us, or what the forces make of us. And that's, you know, that's part of just what I found really gripping. You know, it's not that often that you can read a novel where such a punch is delivered early that you know that essentially 5 sisters are going to end up dead, and yet it's this compulsive page turner. And I think it's because of the many ways in which the novel functions, that we're not really reading it exactly to find out what happened, although we do want to find out what happened, but also just to find out the why. The writing is so beautiful. The psychological portraits are so deep. So just for those of you who maybe, you know, are sort of like, oh, we find out they all die like so quickly. How could it be great? Like, it somehow is wildly gripping. I could not stop reading it anyway, because I kept somehow wishing, again, you know, that there would be more escape for more people besides Iris. I kept thinking one of the sisters might somehow surface somewhere, you know, later in the book. And you know, I didn't want to believe it, because I was that invested. So,
well, thank you. So that's like the best review I think I've ever had. So thank you for that.
so I definitely would like to give people a chance to ask questions. And so I'm going to throw out the first one that we have, which is also from Holly. And you know, we are all in a state right now, as we of course so often are in this country, of being in you know, in the aftermath of yet more gun violence, school shooting, etc. And Holly asked, was it hard to balance all these strong themes: guns, patriarchy, sisterhood? Talk about, I guess, like a novel in which multiple things are going on, not timelines, but themes, you know, ghost stories, profound psychology, like a little bit more about that per Holly's question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love to write things that have a lot of layers to it. So that's not just like a simple page turner. You know, I think you know, going back to the idea you were talking about, how, you know, kind of a big part of what happens at the beginning. And I love those kinds of stories of like, not exactly what or how did it happen? Like, you kind of have the broad idea of like, how did it happen? Why did it happen? And getting those answers by going through the book. So I really like telling stories that way. And I think that, I mean, in this book is the only time I've tried it, but I really like it. And I think that I was sort of subverting the idea that this isn't just a page turner type of book, that I want there to be more going on here, that it's in the framework of a Gothic ghost story, but that's not its raison d'etre. You know, that's not why I'm telling it. I'm using that for my own means to tell this other kind of very feminist, subversive story that I want to tell. And so it was a lot to balance. It was very hard to figure out how to tell the story. That was one of the difficulties of it, because I had, the idea, this trauma that the daughters had inherited, and what happens to them. I had, the firearms, because it is a family that owns this firearms company of this very iconic rifle dating back to like the Civil War. And then there's ghosts and, art and all of this stuff. And so I think the reader has to do a lot of work. I try and leave, guideposts and things, but I think that readers kind of have to think about how all of that fits together, and how, for example, the guns and the legacy of that fits in with what happens to the sisters, or does it, or how does it connect? So I don't really spell that out, but I do kind of hint, certain kinds of hints and things, but I kind of trust the reader to sort of be taking all this in and seeing how they think it fits together. I think with Belinda, you're talking about her mental illness. I feel like, and Iris comes to understand her mother, that, so for the mother wakes up in the middle of the night screaming. That's what she does almost every night, because she thinks that these ghosts of the rifle victims are haunting her. And so her other daughters just don't pay any attention to her, but Iris comes to understand that she's this woman that nobody will listen to, nobody will believe, nobody will listen to. And so she basically had began to communicate that way, that she was, quote unquote crazy, because that's how society made her, so that her reaction to how she was being treated was that it manifested itself as, I'm haunted, I'm screaming, I have all these premonitions, which of course she was right in her premonitions. But there is something going on with Belinda. She has other kind of intuition or knowledge, obviously, but just kind of playing around with her mental problems, and then Iris's later, her psychological problems, are reactions to a society, a very repressive society. We look at today and how young people have record levels of anxiety and depression. Well, it's understandable why they have that, Right. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. And so I'm very interested in the idea of how people interact or react to like trauma in society and in their life, and how sometimes they might be diagnosed as having psychological problems because they don't know how to deal with it or cope with it. So
when in reality, it's fairly uncopable,
Yeah.
If you were a teen at this moment in history who was having legit no mental health issues whatsoever, you would almost have to wonder about that. It is not normal. Maybe if you're 3, you don't know, it's not normal to have spent a year and a half in your bedroom, but anybody who is old enough to remember being in school and to remember being in the world, like prior to this global pandemic. But then of course, also, well, what even is school? It's a dangerous place these days. And per that discussion, not so much going into veering into talking about school shootings or anything, but just the way that the past is not gone, right? That these things, all of these issues that you raise in your novel are not in the past. So, forced childbirth, all of these things are still happening. And so I was wondering, so in my memoir, I use some stats, and one of the things that is often cited is that women in marital relationships report much less life satisfaction than men in marital relationships, and that among general society, 70% of divorces are initiated by women, and when you get to the kind of upper echelon of education, it's close to 90%. And so just when thinking about that, we can see married, right? So I'm not here to diss marriage per se, but that there's still something going on with the institution of marriage that is very much still a feminist issue, even if not in perhaps the binary way of, earlier feminism of just like, don't get married ever, don't, Andrea Dworkin all ape and so forth, but
Yeah.
I just wondered if you have any thoughts about that, about the state of the institution of marriage in contemporary culture, and the ways that it may or may not be used to kind of control women or to decrease life satisfaction in women.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I'm not married. I've never been married. So, it's funny because most of the novel takes place in the 50s, right? In this very repressive society. And I was, worried about, well, people today going to be able to relate to that. And then, right as the book comes out, we have, the Alito, the leaked opinion, which is just this extremist, document quoting a witch hunter and someone who had women executed for witchcraft in 2022. And so, I'm like, the novel became like scarily relevant, even more relevant just right as it was being published. But the interesting thing is, I'm Generation X, but I was raised for a big chunk of my growing up in Utah. And so the world of the cherry robbers wasn't as foreign, I grew up born in the 70s, but mostly the 80s, kind of when I came of age, early 90s. And I lived in a culture where that was the expectations for women were basically the same, like, married young, lots and lots of kids, stay home, be dependent on your husband, all of that. And so I grew up running away from that. I think that part of the cherry robbers comes from that fear that I had of being sucked into that and how I needed to really like escape from that kind of a culture. And so I think, talking about marriage and things, I think that's my experience. I don't know if I can speak to, exactly what you were asking about, because I just have this sort of different experience of
Right.
growing up seeing it like almost like a 1950s, even though it was the 80s and 90s, and that I really didn't want anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's linked to me writing the story where marriage is like a gothic horror story. So
Sure. That makes sense. So we've got a women and children first question from Sarah. So Sarah says, we are seeing a surge of interest in Gothic literature, especially horror at Women and Children First. Do you have any theories about why that is? I do, Sarah, but let us ask our author.
Well, I would love to hear, if you don't mind, I would love to hear what you think.
I was just basically thinking that it's just an extension of the way that dystopian stories became so incredibly popular in the wake of 2016. I think we are living, and I'm really, really careful about not wanting to somehow buy into toxic nostalgia where the past was so ideal, because obviously, particularly if you're a woman or a person of color or a person in the queer community, a person with a disability, like there's never been any utopia to look back on. But we are living in a time that is more troubled, it seems, in many ways than the time in which you and I were younger, and that for a while there was this illusion of progress, again, not utopia, not this sort of like bizarre post-racial everything is great, BS that we were sometimes being fed by the media and by the right, but we were living in a culture where gay marriage had been made legal. You could be gay in the armed services. You could essentially, you could have an abortion. We had elected our first Black president, and then we had reelected him, and then suddenly all of literally very quickly we had a Muslim ban, we had concentration camps at the border, we had open season racism, which of course then really extended towards anti-Asian American racism when COVID hit, and there was just this fake rhetoric. And I think that people at this moment in time, it's like realism is dystopia, realism is horror, and And so, whereas post 9/11, I think we saw in the literary culture this sort of like boom of really light, inspirational literature as a reaction to fear, people wanting to just sort of like feel good. I think that, that was one incident and it was horrible. But we've had so many now over the last 7 years or so. People are so bombarded that I think people don't know much what to do with either light entertainment or realism, and are looking more and more towards dystopia and horror to reflect their own inner turmoil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I mean, our reality is dystopian, but it's also like so many things that happened in the Trump administration. People would compare it to the television show like Arrested Development, and they would compare like so many different things that happen in Arrested Development, like treason, and it all was happening. So it's like
Lucille wanted to build the wall.
Yeah. And it was all coming true in this, and so it was almost like we're living in dystopia, but you also can't even make comedy about it because it's just inherently it's like absurd, and so. I think that you're right that people, writers are turning to sort of different forms that allow them to, use things that aren't based just, in reality, because there's no other way to like convey what we're living through. I think, the publishing industry and writing and publishing work so slowly. This novel has been part of my life for an entire decade. So, from terms of when I first kind of was developing the idea. So I feel like the fact that it's coming out now when there's all these other Gothic novels is really kind of a coincidence because it's been, a part of my life for so long. But I think that, as writers, sometimes, I think for writers, it starts earlier from than what you see in the quote unquote marketplace, what books are out there. But I feel like for me, I thought, I wanted to tell this story and I couldn't tell it in reality. It wouldn't have been like a realistic novel. So, the story can't be a realistic story, but so I gravitated towards that type of writing. But I think that, the Gothic has often done that, the Mad Woman in the Attic, thinking of like Jane Eyre, thinking of like Beloved, a more recent example that's a Gothic, very political as well. So the Gothic has been used, particularly by women, I think, for a very long time to tell these kinds of stories, very difficult stories about women's lives. And so given everything that's been happening to women, again, in the backlash and the unraveling of so many of our rights, that perhaps it's not surprising that we're seeing the Gothic again as well become more popular.
So we are just about at the time that Women and Children First is going to come back.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for answering my question. You hit, and that's where I was headed as well. That I needed confirmation from two experts. So thank you for that, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this incredible conversation. Gina's books as well are such good companions. I think there's a lot of thematic, these books are in conversation with Gina's books as well. So check out The Cherry Robbers by all of Gina Frangello's books as well. And we are so delighted that you all chose to join us tonight and have this wonderful celebration of this incredibly nuanced and gripping read. So thank you, Gina. Thank you, Sarai. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you for having us. You all are going to love the book.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for hosting me and for all the work you put into this. I really appreciate it. And I should say, Gina and I have the same agent. So, hi, Alice. It's really fun to be able to do this event together.
Yeah, Alice is in the chat sending lots of love. And I also want to let you know, if someone you know couldn't join us tonight, don't worry. This was recorded. They can click the same link and watch it anytime. So tell your friends. All right. Thank you so much.
you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.